The silence in the first-class cabin was thicker than the clouds they were meant to be flying through. A man in a simple tweed jacket, who just moments ago was the subject of scorn and derision, now held the fate of the entire aircraft in his hands. The flight attendant stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief. The wealthy couple who had tried to have him removed were pale with a dawning, sickening horror. He wasn't just a passenger they could bully. He was the one man who could bring their world and their multi-million-dollar jet crashing down without ever leaving the ground. The recycled air of the Sterling Air Flight SSLL-71, first-class cabin, hummed with a low, expectant energy. It was the sound of money, of quiet privilege. Passengers settled into their spacious pods, accepting glasses of pre-flight champagne and warm towels from smiling attendants. The cabin was a symphony in beige and brushed chrome, designed to soothe the nerves of those for whom air travel was less an adventure and more a routine commute between boardrooms and vacation homes. In seat 1A, nestled by the window, sat Dr. Robert Harrison. To the casual observer, he was an anomaly. He was a black man in his late 40s, his hair neatly trimmed with distinguished flecks of grey at the temples. He wore a simple but well-tailored tweed jacket over a crisp blue shirt, no tie. His shoes were polished leather, practical rather than ostentatious. He held a worn copy of a dense textbook on aerospace materials, science, its pages filled with his own neat, penciled-in annotations. He had politely declined the champagne, opting for a glass of water, which he sipped slowly. He didn't exude wealth, but rather a profound and unshakable stillness, an aura of quiet competence that went largely unnoticed. For Robert, this was simply another leg of another journey. His life was a series of airports, rental cars, and sterile hotel rooms. He was a ghost in the machine of modern aviation, a man whose job was to ensure that the colossal metal birds people trusted their lives to were in fact trustworthy. It was a solemn, often lonely responsibility. He was flying from Chicago to San Francisco for a conference, but his mind was already cataloguing the faint, almost imperceptible tremor he'd felt in the jet bridge, a resonance that was likely meaningless, but one his hyper-attuned senses filed away for future reference. The quiet atmosphere was shattered by the arrival of the passengers for 1B and 1C. They were a couple who didn't so much enter the cabin as they did conquer it. The man, Richard Sterling, was tall and florid, his expensive suit straining slightly at the buttons. His voice was a booming baritone that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. His wife Penelope was a vision of curated perfection, her blonde hair coiffed into a severe but stylish helmet, her diamonds catching the cabin lights with every flick of her wrist. They smelled of expensive perfume and entitlement. "Here we are, darling," Richard announced to the cabin at large. "Right at the front, as it should be." Penelope surveyed the pod, her nose wrinkling slightly as she saw Robert sitting by the window. Her eyes swept over him, taking in his simple jacket and his book, and dismissed him in a single icy glance. She nudged her husband, her voice a theatrical whisper that carried easily through the cabin. "Richard, I wanted the window seat. You know I get anxious when I can't see out." Richard, who was busy trying to cram his oversized carry-on into the overhead compartment, grunted. "Well, this is what the booking said. It's 1B and 1C. The window is 1A. Then he can move." Penelope stated not as a suggestion, but as a fact. She didn't look at Robert. She spoke about him as if he were a piece of furniture that had been placed incorrectly. "We can just swap. It's no bother." Robert kept his eyes on his book, though he was no longer reading the words. He'd experienced this 1,000 times before. The subtle calculations people made, the assumptions that flowed like a toxic current beneath the surface of polite society. He was in a first-class seat, therefore he must be an athlete or a musician or perhaps the recipient of a lucky upgrade. The possibility that he was simply a man who had earned his place, a professional who belonged there as much as anyone, rarely seemed to enter their minds. He had learned long ago that the most powerful response in these situations was a carefully curated nothing. He continued to read, turning a page with deliberate slowness. Richard finally managed to wrestle his bag into place and turned his attention to his wife's complaint. He looked at Robert properly for the first time, his gaze lingering with a dismissive air. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "My wife prefers the window. We're going to need to switch." Robert slowly lowered his book, placing a finger to mark his page. He looked at Richard, his expression perfectly neutral. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and even. "My assigned seat is 1A. I'm quite comfortable here, thank you." Penelope let out a small, incredulous laugh. "Oh, for goodness sake, it's not a negotiation. It's a simple switch a gentleman would offer." "Perhaps," Robert replied, his gaze unwavering. "But I'm not offering. I prefer the window seat as well." Richard's face began to flush, the color rising in his neck. He was a man unaccustomed to the word no. He leaned in his voice, dropping to a low, intimidating growl. "Look, I don't know how you got this ticket, whether it was frequent flyer miles or some kind of diversity voucher, but we are paying customers. And my wife wants that seat." The mention of a diversity voucher was the first real shot across the bow. It was designed to sting, to put Robert in his place, to remind him that in their eyes he was an outsider. Robert felt the familiar weary ache of it, but his expression remained unchanged. He had built a fortress around his emotions over the years, a necessity for a man of his profession and his skin color. "I am also a paying customer," he said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "And this is my seat. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to get back to my reading before takeoff." He raised his book again, a clear signal that the conversation was over. For a moment, Richard Sterling looked as if he might physically explode. His fists were clenched, his jaw working silently. Penelope placed a restraining hand on his arm, her eyes flashing with a different kind of venom. She turned and pressed the flight attendant call button with a sharp, angry jab. This was no longer about a seat. It had become a matter of principle, a battle of wills they had no intention of losing. The quiet man in 1A had just become a problem they were determined to solve. A flight attendant named Brenda appeared almost instantly, her smile bright and professionally manufactured. She was in her late 30s with the practiced poise of someone who had dealt with every conceivable type of passenger. Her eyes darted between the fuming Sterlings and the placid figure of Robert Harrison. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice a soothing balm intended to de-escalate any situation before it began. "Yes, there is a very big problem," Penelope Sterling said, her voice laced with indignation. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward Robert. "This man is refusing to move from my seat." Brenda's smile faltered for a microsecond. She consulted the small tablet in her hand. "Ma'am, my manifest shows you and Mr. Sterling are in 1B and 1C. This gentleman is in 1A. "I am aware of what the manifest says," Richard boomed, stepping forward. "What you are not understanding is that it is a simple request. My wife is a nervous flyer. She requires a window seat to remain calm. It is a matter of her well-being. Any reasonable person would simply accommodate." He emphasized the word reasonable, letting it hang in the air as a clear indictment of Robert. Brenda's gaze shifted to Robert. Her professional training told her to verify the situation, but her instincts, honed by years of serving the wealthy patrons who were the airline's lifeblood, told her to placate the loudest voices. The Sterlings looked like platinum-level, million-mile flyers. Robert Harrison, with his quiet demeanor and tweed jacket, did not. "Sir," she began, her tone gentle but firm, "I understand you're settled, but would you be willing to switch with the lady? Seat 1C is a lovely aisle seat with much more room to stretch out." Robert looked up from his book again. He did not look at the Sterlings. He addressed Brenda directly, his tone still even, but with a new edge of precision. "My boarding pass says 1A. The manifest says 1A. I selected this seat for a specific reason, and I do not wish to move. The issue is not with me. It is with this couple's failure to book the seats they desired." His clear, articulate refusal seemed to stun Brenda for a moment. She had expected a mumbled apology, a reluctant agreement. What she got was a statement of fact, delivered with the finality of a judge's ruling. Penelope gasped dramatically. The nerve. "He's being deliberately difficult. I feel very uncomfortable with his attitude." She clutched Richard's arm. "Richard, I don't feel safe." This was a well-worn and dangerous escalation. The invocation of safety and discomfort was a coded language designed to paint Robert as a threat. It was a subtle but potent weapon, and it hit its mark. Brenda's demeanor shifted. Her professional smile vanished, replaced by a mask of stern concern. The customer was always right, and a customer who felt unsafe was a top priority. Her focus was now entirely on removing the source of the problem. "Siré," Brenda said, her voice losing its gentle edge. "We pride ourselves on a comfortable and safe environment for all our passengers. If a passenger is making others feel unsafe, I am authorized to take action. I am asking you again politely to please switch seats with Mrs. Sterling." Robert closed his book completely, the soft thud echoing in the tense silence. He placed it carefully on the small table next to him. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, his voice low, but carrying a weight that made the couple in row 2 glance over. "I have done nothing to warrant this. I have been sitting here quietly reading a book. This couple approached me with a demand, not a request. When I politely declined, they became aggressive. Their discomfort is a fabrication, a tool to get what they want. It is a performance, and I will not be a party to it. I will not move." Richard Sterling's face was now a thunderous shade of purple. "A performance. You hear that he's calling my wife a liar. That's it. I want him off this plane. He is a disruptive passenger. Get him off this plane now." The situation had spun out of control. Other first-class passengers were now openly staring, their champagne flutes paused halfway to their lips. The hushed cabin had become a theatre with Robert, as the unwilling star of a drama he had not written. Brenda straightened up, her face set. "Sir, if you refuse to cooperate, I will have to get the gate agent and the captain. I need to ask you to consider the consequences. You are delaying the flight for everyone." It was a classic move: isolate the target and turn the other passengers against them. Make them feel the weight of dozens of annoyed stares. Robert, however, was not an ordinary target. He was a man who understood systems, pressures, and protocols better than anyone in the cabin. He knew his rights, but more importantly, he knew the regulations that governed every bolt and wire of the aircraft they were sitting in. "The flight is not being delayed by me, Ma'am," Robert stated calmly. "It is being delayed by a couple making unreasonable demands, and by a crew that is choosing to validate their behavior instead of addressing it. You may get whomever you need to get. I will be waiting. In seat 1A. He picked up his glass of water and took a slow, deliberate sip, his eyes never leaving Brenda's. The flight attendant, utterly flummoxed by this man's refusal to be intimidated, turned on her heel and marched determinedly toward the cockpit. The battle for seat 1A was over. The war for Flight 771 was just beginning. The 10 minutes that followed Brenda's departure felt like an eternity. The Sterlings stood in the aisle, a silent, smouldering monument to indignation. Penelope whispered furiously to Richard, occasionally throwing venomous glances at Robert, who had, to their immense frustration, reopened his book and resumed reading. Or at least he gave the appearance of it. In reality, his mind was racing. He wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford in his line of work, a blinding emotion that clouded judgment. Instead, he felt a profound sense of disappointment. He was a creature of logic and reason, a man who believed in systems in the elegant interplay of physics and engineering that allowed a 400-ton machine to soar through the sky. And yet here he was, trapped in a scenario governed by the most primitive and illogical of human failings, prejudice and ego. He was aware of the other passengers. A man in a suit in 2B was pointedly looking at his phone, trying to feign ignorance. A woman across the aisle in 2D watched with wide, curious eyes. He knew what they saw, a confrontation. He wondered if any of them saw the racial dynamics at play, or if they just saw a stubborn passenger holding up their flight. He suspected it was the latter. People rarely wanted to see the ugliness beneath the surface of things. It was easier to blame the nail that stuck out than to question the hammer. The sound of determined footsteps approaching down the jet bridge signaled the arrival of new players. Brenda returned, and with her was a man in a crisp airline uniform, his name tag identifying him as Frank Miller, the station's duty manager. Miller had the harried, self-important air of a man who believed his job was to solve problems, usually by identifying the path of least resistance and bulldozing it. He did not approach the situation with an open mind. Brenda had already given him her version of events. A disruptive, uncooperative passenger in 1A was making a high-value couple feel unsafe and refusing a simple crew instruction to switch seats. "Sir," Miller began, stopping beside Robert's seat and crossing his arms. He didn't make eye contact initially, instead choosing to address a point on the bulkhead just above Robert's head. "I am Frank Miller, the manager on duty. I understand there's been a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," Robert said, closing his book once more. He met Miller's gaze directly. "There is a demand that I vacate my assigned seat, which I have declined." Miller's eyes finally dropped to Robert, and they were cold and impatient. "Sir, Flight Attendant Brenda explained that Mrs. Sterling is a nervous flyer and requires the window. We are in the customer service business here. We are asking you to make a small accommodation to help a fellow passenger." And as I explained to her, Robert said, his voice dangerously quiet, "Their failure to book the seats they wanted does not create an obligation on my part. I am not the source of their anxiety. I am the target of their entitlement." Penelope let out a theatrical sob. "He's twisting everything. He was glaring at me from the moment I sat down. He has been aggressive and hostile. Frank, I am telling you, as a Diamond Medallion member, I do not feel safe with this man on this airplane." The Diamond Medallion card was played. It was the magic word, the key that unlocked a different level of concern from airline employees like Frank Miller. Miller's posture hardened. His allegiance was clear. "Aggression," Miller's voice took on an accusatory tone. "Hostility. Sir, these are serious claims. We have a zero-tolerance policy for passenger intimidation." Robert felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was the trap. He knew it was coming. It had shifted from a dispute over a seat to an accusation of threatening behavior, his word against theirs. A black man in a tweed jacket versus a wealthy, well-dressed white couple with top-tier airline status. He knew how this equation was typically solved. "The only hostility in this cabin has been directed at me," Robert stated, his voice tight with controlled fury. I was accused of obtaining my ticket through a diversity voucher. I was told I wasn't a gentleman, and now I am being painted as a threat because I have refused to bow to their demands. Look at me. I am sitting here reading a book. Where is the aggression?" He held his hands up, palms open, a gesture of non-aggression. But it was too late. The narrative had been set. "I'm not going to argue with you, sir," Miller said, his tone final. "The flight crew feels the situation has become a security concern. The captain has been briefed. He has authorized me to make you a final offer. You can either move to seat 12B, a vacant seat in economy plus, and we will offer you a $300 travel voucher for the inconvenience, or you will be deplaned. The offer was a profound insult wrapped in corporate procedure. Move from his paid-for-first-class seat to a middle seat in economy, a demotion in front of everyone for a paltry voucher." It was designed to humiliate him into compliance. Richard Sterling smirked a small, triumphant smile. He had won. They had successfully framed Robert as the problem, and now the system was working to eject him. Robert looked at Frank Miller, at his smug, bureaucratic face. He looked at Brenda, who stood behind him, avoiding his eyes, her face a mask of false sympathy. He looked at the Sterlings, their expressions radiating smug victory. He saw the entire system, in that moment, the interlocking gears of privilege and prejudice, all turning to crush someone who didn't fit. He felt a deep, profound weariness, but beneath it, something else began to stir. A cold, hard resolve. They had pushed and pushed. They had made their accusations. They had rendered their verdict. They thought they were dealing with just another passenger. They were about to learn in the most abrupt and permanent way possible how wrong they were. The ultimatum hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Move to 12B or be deplaned. It was a simple choice designed to offer the illusion of one. In Frank Miller's mind, the outcome was preordained. The passenger would either swallow his pride and shuffle back to economy, or he would be escorted off the plane by airport security, creating a cautionary tale for anyone else who dared to disrupt the placid surface of elite travel. Robert Harrison took a slow, deep breath. He could feel the eyes of every person in the cabin on him. He saw the judgment, the impatience, the morbid curiosity. They just wanted to get on with their journey. He was a roadblock, an inconvenient bit of human drama delaying their arrival. He knew that if he were to be marched off this plane, the story they would tell themselves would be simple. He was a troublemaker who got what he deserved. His mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic and analysis, calculated the variables. He could accept the humiliating offer. He could walk away, avoid further confrontation, and file a complaint later that would likely disappear into the ether of a corporate customer service department. It would be the path of least resistance, the one that would allow him to get to his conference on time. It was the sensible thing to do. But then he looked at the smug, triumphant face of Richard Sterling. He saw the cold satisfaction in Penelope's eyes. He saw the procedural indifference on Frank Miller's face, and he understood that this was bigger than a seat. It was about dignity. It was about the quiet daily battles for respect that people who looked like him had to fight in spaces where they were presumed not to belong. To retreat now would be to validate their entire worldview, a world where status, wealth, and race could be weaponized to bend reality to their will. And there was another far more important calculation at play, a professional one. He had a job to do. That job was not in San Francisco, not at the conference he was scheduled to attend. His job was here. Now. On this specific aircraft. That faint tremor in the jet bridge, a maintenance report he had flagged last week about Sterling Air's Chicago hub cutting corners on turnaround inspections, an anonymous tip from a disgruntled mechanic that had been filed just 2 days ago, it all coalesced into a single undeniable point of focus. He wasn't just on this flight by chance. He had chosen it. This confrontation, this ugly display of human behavior, was a distraction. But it was also an opportunity. It had given him a window into the culture of the airline, a culture that seemed to prioritize appeasing the powerful over adhering to principles. And if that was the attitude in the cabin, what was the attitude in the cockpit, in the maintenance hangar? He could not do his job from seat 12B. He could not do it from the terminal. He had to do it from here. The line had been drawn not by him, but for him. He carefully placed his hands on the armrests of seat 1A. He looked directly at Frank Miller, his gaze so intense that the manager for the first time seemed to feel a flicker of uncertainty. Robert's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it resonated with an absolute and terrifying finality. "I will not be moving to seat 12B, he said. A pause. "And I will not be deplaned." Frank Miller blinked. This was not part of the script. The defiance was absolute, without a hint of negotiation or fear. "Sir, that is not a choice you get to make. I am the duty manager, and the captain has given me his authority. If you refuse to leave your seat, you will be considered a security threat, and you will be removed by law enforcement." Richard Sterling chuckled. "You heard him. Get the cops. Let them drag him out." Frank nodded, his confidence returning. He reached for the radio on his shoulder. "This is Miller at Gate C-12. I need security at the aircraft for a non-compliant passenger. Immediate assistance required." The call was made. The die was cast. The other passengers began to murmur, a wave of anxiety and frustration rippling through the cabin. A woman in row 3 pulled out her phone and began to record. Robert remained perfectly still. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, the calm that comes when a difficult decision has been made, and the path forward, however perilous, is clear. He had given them every chance to de-escalate, to be reasonable, to simply follow their own rules of assigned seating. They had refused. They had chosen this path. They had escalated and accused and threatened. They had tried to remove a black man from row 1 because his presence offended their sense of order. They were about to discover that they had not picked a fight with a passenger. They had picked a fight with the very system that allowed their precious airplane to fly. And it was a fight they could not possibly win. Robert watched with detached clinical interest as Frank Miller took a step back to allow room for the approaching security officers. The manager was smiling faintly, believing he was seconds away from victory. The 2 airport security officers who appeared at the cabin door were large, imposing figures. Their presence immediately changed the atmosphere from tense to critical. Their faces were grimly professional. They had a job to do, remove the person Frank Miller pointed at. "That's him," Miller said, gesturing toward Robert with a flick of his wrist. "Seat 1A, refusing to comply with crew instructions, causing a disturbance." The officers began to move down the narrow aisle, their expressions unreadable. Passengers leaned away, creating a path. The woman who was filming held her phone a little higher. This was the climax. As the first officer reached his row, Robert slowly held up a single, calm hand. It was not a gesture of surrender, but a signal to pause. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Before this proceeds any further, I suggest you ask Mr. Miller and the flight crew to confirm my identity." The lead officer stopped. "Sir, we've been told you're a non-compliant passenger, and I am telling you that there is more to this situation than you have been briefed on." Robert interrupted his tone, polite but firm. "My name is Dr. Robert Harrison." He spoke the name with a quiet emphasis. To everyone else in the cabin, it was just a name. It meant nothing. Frank Miller scoffed. "His name doesn't matter. "He's the problem. Please remove him." Robert ignored him. He leaned down and unlatched his simple, well-worn leather briefcase. He clicked open the clasps with a pair of sharp, metallic snaps. The Sterlings watched, expecting him to finally be packing his belongings. Brenda looked on her arms, crossed, impatient. But Robert didn't pull out a laptop or a newspaper. He reached into a specially designed compartment and withdrew a dark blue leather-bound credential wallet. He flipped it open. Inside, shielded by protective plastic, was a gold seal and a photo identification card. He held it up for the security officers to see. "As I was saying," he continued, his voice now imbued with a cold official resonance. "My name is Dr. Robert Harrison, and this," he angled the wallet so Frank Miller could see it clearly, "is my identification as a senior airworthiness directive inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration, United States Department of Transportation." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so profound it felt as if the air had been physically sucked out of the cabin. The security officers froze their eyes wide as they read the credentials. Frank Miller's smug expression dissolved, replaced by a wave of confusion, then dawning horror. His face went slack, the color draining from it, until it was the color of spoiled milk. Brenda's jaw literally dropped. She brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the gold seal. Richard and Penelope Sterling, who couldn't see the ID, clearly looked on in confusion. "What is that?" Richard demanded. "Some kind of fake badge." But the reaction of the crew told him it was very, very real. Robert turned his piercing gaze on Frank Miller. "You have been operating under the assumption that I am a passenger," he said, his voice low and cutting. "I am not. I am a federal agent. My presence on this flight is in an official capacity. I am conducting a surprise, unannounced safety and compliance audit of this aircraft Sterling Air Flight 771 and its on-duty crew." He let the words sink in. He saw the flicker of panic in Brenda's eyes, the utter terror on Frank Miller's face. "My refusal to move," he continued the words now like ice chips, "was not an act of passenger non-compliance. It was a test of your crew's adherence to protocol in the face of pressure from high-status passengers. A test which, I must say, you have failed in every conceivable way. You did not de-escalate. You did not defend the passenger manifest. You sided with the aggressors and attempted to unlawfully remove a federal agent from his place of duty." He then turned his attention to the security officers. "Thank you for your prompt response, gentlemen. Your services will not be required for removal. However, I will need you to secure the jet bridge. No one gets on or off this aircraft without my express permission. Is that understood?" The lead officer, his professional demeanor completely rebooted, nodded sharply. "Yes, sir. Understood." He and his partner immediately turned and took up positions at the cabin door, their posture shifting from enforcers to guards. They were no longer Frank Miller's muscle. They were Dr. Harrison's. Finally, Robert Harrison looked at Richard and Penelope Sterling. For the first time, he let a flicker of his true feelings show not anger, but a sort of weary clinical pity. "You wanted this seat," he said quietly. "You harassed a passenger, you made false accusations, and you abused your status. All for a slightly better view." He stood up slowly, the authority radiating from him, now a palpable force. "Well, you've certainly gotten everyone's attention. Now I'd like to have a word with the captain, immediately. And then I am going to begin my inspection, starting with the maintenance logs. This aircraft is not going anywhere." The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. The quiet man, in one way, was no longer a victim. He was the judge, the jury, and for Sterling Air, he was about to become the executioner. The transformation of Dr. Robert Harrison from unassuming passenger to commanding federal inspector was chilling to witness. The tweed jacket seemed to take on the quality of a uniform, his calm demeanor now a sign of absolute, unassailable authority. The captain, a veteran pilot named George Ballard, arrived from the cockpit, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. He had been told there was a disruptive passenger. Now he was being told a federal agent was on his plane. "I'm Captain Ballard," he said, extending a hand to Robert. Robert shook it firmly. "Dr. Robert Harrison, FAA. Captain, I'm officially notifying you that I am initiating a full ramp and maintenance log audit on this aircraft, effective immediately. Please instruct your co-pilot to begin preparations for deplaning all passengers back to the terminal." "Deplane?" the captain asked, shocked. "Sir, we're already delayed. Is this really necessary?" "It is," Robert said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This aircraft's airworthiness is now under official review. No one is flying on it until I clear it. That includes you, your crew, and especially me. Now please, comply." Captain Ballard, a man accustomed to being the ultimate authority on his aircraft, recognized a higher power when he saw one. He nodded grimly and turned to give the orders. An announcement was made. The passengers who had been watching the drama unfold with a mixture of fear and fascination groaned in unison, but began to gather their belongings. As they filed out, their eyes were drawn to the scene in row 1. Frank Miller stood as if rooted to the floor, his face ashen. Brenda was whispering frantically into a phone, likely to a union representative. And the Sterlings, they were shrinking. The aura of power and importance they had projected had completely evaporated, leaving behind two pale, frightened, and deeply humiliated people. As they passed, Robert Penelope refused to meet his gaze, while Richard shot him a look of pure, impotent hatred. It bounced off Robert's wall of professional indifference. Once the cabin was empty, except for the flight crew, and Robert, the real work began. "Captain," Robert said, his tone all business, "I need the complete maintenance logbook for this airframe, digital and paper copies for the last 90 days. I want the flight crew's duty time records, and I want a direct line to your head of maintenance at this station." For the next 2 hours, the first-class cabin of Flight 771 became Dr. Harrison's command center. The logbooks were brought. Robert pored over them, his eyes scanning pages of technical data with an unnerving speed and comprehension. He cross-referenced flight cycles with scheduled maintenance checks, his finger tracing lines of data, his brow occasionally furrowing. He had the station's chief mechanic, a harried-looking man named Don, patched through on the captain's radio. "Don, this is Inspector Harrison," Robert's voice crackled. "I'm looking at the log for airframe 73 Delta. I see a note about a recurring vibration sensor fault on engine number 2, reported 3 flights ago. The log says the sensor was replaced and tested. Can you confirm?" There was a hesitant pause on the other end. Yes, sir. That's correct. We swapped the sensor." "Did you run a full borescope inspection of the turbine blades?" Robert asked. A borescope is a flexible fiber optic camera used to inspect the inside of an engine without disassembling it. Another pause, longer this time. "The procedure only called for a sensor swap and system reset, sir. A full borescope wasn't required. A recurring fault on a critical sensor is a primary indicator for a deeper mechanical issue, Don. You know that," Robert stated flatly. "I want that engine cowling opened up. Now. And get a borescope. I'll be down on the tarmac in 5 minutes." Robert, now wearing a high-visibility FAA jacket that had been in his briefcase, strode off the plane and down the stairs to the tarmac, leaving the stunned flight crew behind. He moved with the easy confidence of a man in his natural habitat. He directed the ground crew with curt, precise commands. Under the harsh glare of the airport lights, the massive engine cowling was opened, exposing the intricate guts of the jet engine. When the borescope camera was finally fed, deep inside, its findings were displayed on a small, high-resolution monitor. Robert stared at the screen, his expression hardening. There, on one of the high-pressure turbine blades, a component spinning at thousands of rotations per minute under incredible heat and stress, was a tiny, almost invisible line. "There," Robert said, pointing. "Freeze the image. Zoom in." The image magnified. The tiny line resolved into a clear, undeniable hairline fracture. It was a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. At 35,000 feet, that blade could have disintegrated, tearing through the engine, the wing, and potentially the fuselage. The vibration sensor had been screaming about it, and the ground crew, under pressure to keep the planes flying on a tight schedule, had treated the symptom instead of looking for the disease. They had swapped the sensor and signed off on it, a fatal shortcut. Robert straightened up from the monitor, his face grim. He turned to the assembled group, the captain, the chief mechanic, Frank Miller, who had nervously followed them down. "This turbine blade has a critical stress fracture. The maintenance log shows the vibration fault was improperly addressed. The sign-off was a pencil whip. You were seconds away from sending 180 souls up in a flying death trap." The silence on the tarmac was broken only by the distant whine of other jets. "As of this moment, Doctor," Harrison announced, his voice ringing with the full weight of federal law, "I am issuing an emergency airworthiness directive. Sterling Air Flight 771 is grounded. This airframe's certificate of airworthiness is hereby revoked, pending a full, fleet-wide investigation into your maintenance procedures. This jet is not flying anywhere but to a repair depot. My full report will be on the National Administrator's desk by morning." He had not just grounded a jet. He had pulled a thread that was about to unravel the entire airline. The fallout from the grounding of Flight 771 was not a quiet affair. It was a nuclear bomb detonated in the heart of Sterling Air's operations and reputation. Dr. Robert Harrison's report was as meticulous as it was damning. It detailed not only the critical maintenance failure, but also the toxic corporate culture observed in the cabin, where high-value customers were empowered to harass passengers and crew alike, creating an environment where rules and procedures were treated as optional. For Richard and Penelope Sterling, the karma was swift and merciless. As they sat in the crowded terminal, stewing in their humiliation, Richard's phone began to buzz incessantly. The woman who had filmed the confrontation had uploaded the video. It went viral in a matter of hours. The clip titled, "Arrogant Couple Tries to Bully Man. Off-Plane Finds Out." "He's the FAA inspector about to ground it," was a sensation. Their names were quickly identified. It didn't take long for reporters to connect the dots. Richard Sterling, the arrogant passenger, was the nephew of the airline's founder and CEO, Alastair Sterling. He was flying to San Francisco to finalize a multi-billion-dollar merger that would have been the crowning achievement of his career. The news of the grounding, the FAA investigation, and the viral video hit the financial markets like a shockwave. Sterling Air's stock plummeted by 30% overnight. The company they were merging with, spooked by the catastrophic safety and PR crisis, pulled out of the deal. In a single afternoon, Richard Sterling's entitlement had not only cost him a business deal, it had wiped out hundreds of millions of dollars of his family's fortune and jeopardized the future of the entire airline. He and Penelope became pariahs, their faces plastered across news sites as the epitome of airborne arrogance. For Brenda, the flight attendant, and Frank Miller the duty manager, the consequences were just as severe. They were suspended without pay, pending an internal investigation, which was merely a formality. They were the public faces of the airline's failure. The video showed them clearly siding with the Sterlings and threatening Robert. They had failed to follow basic protocols and had been complicit in the harassment of a federal agent. They were fired within the week, their careers in aviation likely over. Their attempt to appease the powerful had cost them everything. The FAA investigation, spearheaded by Dr. Harrison's findings, burrowed deep into Sterling Air's operations. They uncovered a pattern of rushed inspections, falsified maintenance logs, and a corporate culture that prioritized on-time departures over safety mandates. The airline was hit with the largest fine in FAA history, forced to ground dozens of its aircraft for mandatory inspections, and operate under strict federal oversight for years. The name Sterling, once a symbol of luxury air travel, became synonymous with negligence and scandal. And Dr. Robert Harrison. He did not appear on the news. He gave no interviews. He was not a man who sought the spotlight. His name appeared only once, deep within the official FAA report, as the Inspector of Record. The day after grounding Flight 771, he was on another flight with another airline, sitting in another unassuming window seat with a textbook in his lap. He was flying to a different city to inspect a different plane. He took no joy in the ruin of the Sterlings or the firings of the crew. That was simply the logical outcome of their actions. His satisfaction came from something purer, the knowledge that a fractured turbine blade was now sitting in a lab instead of spinning at 10,000 RPM 6 miles above the Earth. He had done his job. A potential catastrophe had been averted. The system, for all its flaws, had worked. Because he was there to make it work. He was the quiet man, the ghost in the machine, the guardian of the skies. And as he watched the clouds drift by his window, he turned the page of his book and continued to read. 6 months after the grounding of Flight 771, the media storm had moved on to other tempests, but the echoes of that day on the tarmac in Chicago continued to ripple through the lives of everyone involved. The story was no longer a headline, but it had become a permanent part of their histories, a defining event that had irrevocably altered their futures. In a noisy, sprawling maintenance hangar at O'Hare International Airport, a 62-year-old mechanic named Leo Kowalski wiped grease from his hands with a worn rag. Leo had worked for Sterling Air for 38 years. His back ached, his knuckles were permanently scarred, and he knew the unique groans and shudders of a Boeing 777 better than he knew the sound of his own son's voice. He was also the man who had sent the anonymous tip to the FAA. It had been an act of quiet desperation. For months, he'd watched the pressure from management, from men like Frank Miller Mount. Turnaround times were being squeezed, staff were being cut, and mechanics were being urged to sign off on fixes that were temporary at best. He'd seen the recurring vibration sensor fault on airframe 73 Delta come through twice. The first time he'd argued for a full borescope inspection. He was overruled. "Just swap the part, Leo, we need the plane at the gate," his supervisor had barked. The second time it came through, he saw a junior mechanic perform the same superficial fix and sign the log. That night, Leo went home, his stomach in knots. He thought about the thousands of people he'd sent into the sky over his career. He thought about his own grandchildren, who flew once a year to see him. He sat at his old desktop computer, and with trembling fingers he typed out a detailed anonymous report to the FAA's safety hotline, flagging the specific aircraft and the corner-cutting maintenance culture at the Chicago hub. When the news of the grounding broke, Leo felt a terrifying cocktail of vindication and fear. He watched the viral video, saw the face of the inspector, Dr. Harrison, and felt a profound sense of relief. The FAA investigation that followed was a whirlwind. It confirmed everything he had reported and more. Management was cleaned out, new procedures were implemented, and a culture of safety was, for the first time in years, prioritized over schedules. Leo never told a soul what he had done. He was a ghost just like Dr. Harrison. He'd done his job not for praise, but because it was the right thing to do. His reward was the quiet confidence he now felt when he signed his name in a logbook, knowing the job was done right. Far from the clatter of the hangar in a silent mahogany-panelled study in a near-empty mansion, Richard Sterling poured himself another whiskey. The ruin was complete. The merger was dead. The family fortune was decimated. And his name was a punchline in business schools. Penelope had left him unable to bear the public humiliation and the sudden downgrade in their lifestyle. She'd called him a fool, not for his arrogance, but for getting caught. Richard, however, had learned nothing. In his mind, he was the sole victim of a vast conspiracy. He would rant to the few friends who still took his calls, his voice a slurred torrent of blame. He blamed the radical leftist media for making the video viral. He blamed the woman who filmed it, the social justice warrior, passengers who watched the incompetent captain. Most of all, he blamed Dr. Robert Harrison. He saw him not as a professional doing his duty, but as a man who had intentionally and maliciously set out to destroy him, too. He had it in for me from the start, Richard would snarl. It was a setup, all because he couldn't stand seeing someone like me in charge. The idea that his own actions, his entitlement, his condescension, his bullying were the cause of his downfall was a concept his ego was fundamentally incapable of processing. He was a man trapped in the collapsing prison of his own making, rattling the bars and cursing the jailer, never once looking at the key he himself had turned in the lock. Meanwhile, in a quiet, sunlit office in a government building in Washington, D.C., Dr. Robert Harrison reviewed a report on metal fatigue in composite materials. The Sterling Air incident had made him a reluctant legend within the FAA. Junior inspectors spoke his name with a reverence usually reserved for aviation pioneers. He had become the living embodiment of their agency's mission. His supervisor, a pragmatic woman named Eleanor Vance, had called him in a month prior. "The administrator's office wants you, Robert," she had said. "They're creating a new national oversight post. You'd be heading up the entire surprise audit program. More pay, more prestige. It's yours if you want it." Robert had thanked her, but politely declined. The offer was tempting, but a desk job in D.C. was a gilded cage. He hadn't gotten into this work for prestige. He'd gotten into it because he loved the elegant, brutal honesty of physics and engineering. He loved the machines. His place was in the field where he could lay his hands on a fuselage, look a mechanic in the eye, and feel the subtle vibrations of a jet bridge. He was a guardian, and a guardian's post is on the wall, not in the king's chambers. A few weeks after that meeting, a simple plain white envelope arrived in the inter-office mail with no return address, just his name and department typed on the front. Inside was a single piece of paper folded once. There was no signature, only a short, typewritten sentence. It read, "Thank you," from one of the guys on the ground who saw it too. Robert held the note for a long time. Of all the outcomes of that day, the news reports, the official commendations, the downfall of the Sterlings. This small, anonymous message of solidarity meant the most. It was a connection to the other end of the chain of integrity, a reminder that for every arrogant executive cutting corners, there was a quiet professional in the trenches trying to do the right thing. It was a confirmation that he was not alone. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his now famous leather briefcase alongside his credentials. He then turned and looked out his office window at the planes arcing gracefully across the sky over the Potomac. Each one was a testament to 1,000 jobs done right, 1,000 quiet acts of integrity. The echoes of Flight 721 were a harsh lesson for some, but for him they were a reaffirmation of a simple, powerful truth. Character is who you are when no one is watching, but integrity is what you do when the entire world is at stake. And his work was not yet finished. The story of Dr. Robert Harrison is a powerful reminder that true authority doesn't always come in a flashy suit or with a booming voice. Sometimes it sits quietly in seat 1A, armed with knowledge, integrity, and the courage to stand firm against injustice. It shows how quickly the tables can turn when arrogance collides with competence, and how the seeds of prejudice can bear the bitter fruit of karma. This wasn't just about one man winning a dispute over a seat. It was about the system of safety and accountability holding firm against the pressures of privilege and greed, preventing a disaster and delivering a lesson that echoed from the first-class cabin to the stock market floor. If this story of sudden twists and deserved karma resonated with you, please help us share it by hitting the like button. And for more incredible real-life stories where justice is served in the most unexpected ways, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Don't forget to leave a comment below telling us what you think was the most satisfying moment of karma. Thank you for listening.